All right, Chapter 19, Section 2. In all reality, understand that the United States really wasn't prepared for war, especially this war. America's army was pretty small. I think it ranked about 15th in the world. It had about 200,000 men currently in the army. Of its officers, very few of them actually had any combat experience. And so President Wilson, when he asks Congress for a declaration of war, has a really, really huge task. One, he has to try to convince a country who's not really in favor of this, fighting a war, or sending their sons and fathers across an ocean to fight in Europe. He's got to convince them that this is a pretty important task to preserve democracy and make this a war to end all wars. And then he has to raise a massive army in a short amount of time. Why? Because Europe was running out of men and money. And so in this section, we're going to describe, first of all, how the U.S. kind of mobilized for war. We'll summarize some American battle scenes, take a look at some new weapons, as well as some of the medical problems that we faced in World War I. And finally, look at U.S. offensives, and finally, the end of the war. So as we look at American power tipping the balance, America will mobilize. And so how did the United States raise a massive army during World War I? Now, Congress passes what's called the Selective Service Act in 1917. This act required men to register with the government in order to be randomly selected for military service. By the end of 1918, 24 million men had registered under this act. And of this number, almost 3 million men were called up. About 2 million actually reached Europe before the truce was signed. In this number, you have also about 400,000 African Americans that served in the armed forces, and more than half of them would serve in France. Understand, though, African American soldiers still faced segregation during this time and would serve in segregated units. The eight-month training period took place partly in the United States and partly in Europe. During this time, men put in almost 17-hour days in target practice, bayonet drills, kitchen duty, cleaning up the grounds. And sadly, since real weapons were in short supply, soldiers often drilled with fake weapons. Rocks as grenades, sticks as guns, or with bayonets. And although women weren't allowed to enlist, the Army reluctantly would accept women in the Army Corps of Nurses. I think the Navy eventually would do that too, and even the Marines. Well, let's take a look at ship production, because this becomes a very important part of this mass production that needed to take place. So in addition to a vast army that had to be created and trained, the United States had to find a way to transport these men, transport food and equipment over thousands of miles of ocean. And this task wasn't easy because guess what's out there? German submarines that are really making it difficult for ships to cross the ocean. Well, to expand its fleet, the United States government took 4 crucial steps. First, the government's going to exempt many shipyard workers from the draft, and they're going to give others a deferred classification, in other words, delaying their participation in the draft. Secondly, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to join in a public relations campaign to emphasize the importance of ship work. The purpose of that was so that men didn't feel guilty and others didn't look down at them for not getting in line to volunteer. Third, shipyards used prefabrication techniques. This is very important. Instead of building the entire ship right there in the yard, standardized parts were built somewhere else and then shipped to the yard, and that's where they were assembled. And the picture in the lower right gives you that idea. These are massive shipyards. In this case, they're looking at building 4 ships simultaneously. And without prefabricated techniques, this would take almost a year to build each one of those things. And you can imagine how many men are working at those shipyards at the same time too. So this prefabrication, by the way, allowed ships to be built rather quickly, usually in 3 months or less. So that became extremely crucial. And finally, the government would take over commercial and private ships. And the purpose of that was to convert them to kind of for war use as they would cross the Atlantic. Well, Part B, America turns the tide. Let's take a look at that, because German U-boats often attacked our merchant ships in the Atlantic, and that was a serious threat, not only for getting our men over there, but getting supplies to the men that were already fighting there. And so they developed what was called a convoy system, in which you had a heavy guard of destroyers that escorted merchant ships back and forth across the Atlantic in groups. And as a result of this, by the fall of 1917, shipping losses were already cut in half. The picture on the right, upper right, gives you a little bit of an idea of that convoy system. Hopefully you're able to kind of take a look at the words with arrows pointed at certain ships as to the purpose of that. The U.S. Navy is also going to help lay a 230-mile barrier of mines across the North Sea from Scotland to Norway. And the purpose of that was to try to bottleneck all the U-boats, German U-boats, that sailed from German ports and keep them from getting out into the Atlantic. And that was also extremely helpful. By early 1918, the Germans found it very difficult to replace their losses, as well as staffing their submarines with trained individuals as well as officers. So, and then how did the arrival of new American troops affect the spirit of the Allied troops? Remember, we're coming in very late in the game here. And you look at the picture down below, there's a lot of men in that group, and you're talking 2 million men. That's a lot of people that are coming over. And so one of the main contributions that American troops made to the Allied war effort, and this is really the biggest thing, apart from the numbers, the massive number of men, was their freshness and enthusiasm, which helped increase the morale of those exhausted and demoralized European forces. Because keep in mind, something very drastic just happened in Europe during this time that made it almost impossible for Allied forces to believe that they were actually going to win. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. In Part C, fighting over there and the war introduces new hazards. It's kind of important to understand that the United States usually has a main military commander in charge of its armies. And the American armed forces, as they came over to Europe, were known as, and even in America, were known as the American Expeditionary Force, otherwise AEF for short. American Expeditionary Force. and they were led by General John Pershing. And his picture is right there, kind of in the center, upper center there. If you recall General Pershing, he was the guy Wilson had sent into Mexico prior to World War I to chase Pancho Villa. And as a result of World War I, withdrew him from Mexico, and now he becomes the head of American forces. But American forces really didn't go to Europe and fight as American forces. They joined other Allied forces that were already fighting. General Pershing will insist finally that he gets his own command, and we'll talk about that on another slide then too. By the way, if you ever read about World War I soldiers from the United States, very often they're referred to as doughboys. Where that term came, nobody quite knows exactly, but that was usually the reference to American soldiers by European allies. All right, looking at new weapons used during World War I. The battlefields of World War I saw the first large-scale use of weapons that would become standard in modern war. Although some of these weapons were new, others, like the machine gun, had been so refined, they literally would change the nature of warfare. The two most innovative weapons, though, were really the tank and the airplane. And you can see a picture of the tank and the airplane in the center middle there, and the machine gun, of course, down below. Machine guns in World War I, World War II would often find this problem too, is that they had such rapid fire and could shoot so many bullets that the friction created such heat that very often it could actually cause problems with the barrel getting too hot and expanding, and bullets would just get jammed. But the tank and the airplane are probably the goofiest looking thing. They become, again, a change in modern warfare. Tanks ran on caterpillar type treads and were built of steel so that bullets could bounce off. The very first ones really weren't that effective, but over time the British learned very effectively how to drive large number of tanks through barbed wire defenses, clearing the path for their infantry. So they got better and better at this. Of course, Germany eventually gets better and better at this too. The early airplanes were extremely flimsy. You can kind of look at those little buggers and realize they actually used those in battle. They didn't at first. They used them mostly for scouting or reconnaissance. But eventually, pilots from planes of Allied and Central Powers actually went up against each other, and at very first, they fought up there with pistols and shot at each other. But that was kind of hard to do, to fly the plane and do that at the same time, that they started mounting machine guns in the cockpit so that they could fire at them with machine guns. But interestingly, they had a problem there too, because if they shot straight ahead, they usually shot their propellers off. The Germans eventually introduced an interrupter gear that actually permitted the stream of bullets to avoid the propeller blades. And over time, over the course of this war too, airplanes were built to be faster, more heavy duty, and could actually start carrying a heavy bomb load. Artillery also makes a major change, and that's kind of a big picture in the lower right there, where you saw an advance from earlier wars in the 1800s, being able to pummel bombs or cannonballs 15 miles, already now 70 miles away. So artillery units usually weren't even within the sight of the battlefield. They were much farther away. So that becomes a major change in all of this modern warfare as well. So looking at, again, some of the new hazards, we look at medical services. Usually every war brings about some sort of advancement, also sees interesting scenarios that create new problems, and also they find new ways of dealing with certain things. And this World War I was no exception. And so whether or how did medical services respond to the physical and emotional wounds suffered by these soldiers? Well, fighting men in World War I were just surrounded by filth. Just try to imagine living in those front lines and in those trenches, not to mention all the mud and water just sitting there and dead bodies and everything, dead animals. They're surrounded by filth, lice, rats, and polluted water. You can kind of see that gentleman in the top right there. That water doesn't just go away right away. And again, that's just a breeding ground for bacteria, mosquitoes, you name it. And very often that water that soldiers were using or cleaning their food with or just cleaning themselves with did nothing but probably cause problems for them, including dysentery, which is kind of like the flu out the back way. Soldiers also inhaled poisonous gas. Poisonous gas was used quite often in World War I. If you take a look at the nurses in the lower right there, you can see they're wearing gas masks. That was a common view of people in Europe during the World War I, because that was a common threat to people, was this poisonous gas. You also had the constant stench of decaying bodies. They suffered from lack of sleep, the constant bombardment of artillery, and things like that usually led to battle fatigue and shell shock. And shell shock was just a complete emotional collapse from which many of these soldiers never really recovered from, and usually sat in insane asylums the rest of their life. Physical problems included a disease called trench foot, and that was a result of standing in cold, wet trenches for long periods of time of either water or mud, and not being able to change into dry socks or boots. And sadly, first the toes would start to turn red or blue, and then they'd become numb. Finally, they just literally would start to rot. And very often, toes, if not feet, literally had to be amputated. I was going to show you a picture of trench foot and trench mouth, but it's so gross, I chose not to. Because you'd get this painful infection of the gums in the throat. That was trench mouth, and that was also common in soldiers as well. The Red Cross and ambulances of the Red Cross, often staffed by American volunteers, carried wounded from the battlefield to the hospital. And of course, that becomes a way in which more lives are saved than trying to keep them there in the field and try to field dress them. Doctors also found many ways in fighting infection. This also becomes a time when a lot of rehab for wounded soldiers actually started to become a real science, and the idea of skin grafts. And so there are a lot of advances that take place during this time period in the medical field as well. In Part D, we're going to look at American troops going on the offensive. And so we'll look at what important battles U.S. troops would fight in. And here's the interesting scenario that was happening during this time. Russia pulls out of the war in 1917. And so Germany doesn't have to fight on the Eastern Front anymore. And so they start moving all their soldiers to the Western Front. And this is that morale, this loss of morale that European soldiers, when they heard about that, it was almost like just a punch in the gut. And so the Americans arrived just in time to really kind of help stop that German advancement. In the first place really is at a place called Cantonay. So if you look on the map, most of these places are kind of identified pretty clearly, and this is going to be kind of center left on that map there. Cantonay in France. Several weeks later, U.S. troops are going to play a major role in throwing back the Germans. In other words, they'll stop the German advance at a place called Chateau Thierry and Bella Woods. And then in July and August, they're going to help in the Second Battle of the Marne, and this becomes a major turning point in the war because the Allied forces actually start to advance towards the German front. And in September, the US soldiers will begin to mount an offensive against the Germans at a place called Saint-Mihiel and, of course, the Meuse-Argonne. And this was a US-led advance. This is where General Pershing finally got his way, and American soldiers are going to be pretty much heading the party over on the Western Front at that point. They will suffer extreme losses, by the way, too. And in every war, you see these heroes pop up here and there, and there were several of them throughout World War I on both sides. But as an American, one of the guys that's kind of pointed out, in fact, General Pershing even refers to him as one of the greatest soldiers of the AEF, and that's Elvin York. During the fighting of the Meuse-Argonne, Elvin York really gains his fame. Elvin York is from Tennessee. He actually sought exemption as a conscientious objector. In other words, as someone that opposed warfare on moral grounds. But he eventually decided that it was morally acceptable to fight if the cause was just. And he must have believed Wilson when he said this was a war to save democracy. On October of 1918, armed with just a rifle and a revolver, York's going to kill 25 Germans single-handedly. And then with the help of 6 other American soldiers, he'll capture 132 prisoners. Finally, what caused the collapse of Germany? In the early November of 1918, Austria-Hungary finally has enough and they surrender to the Allies. That same day, Germany is also going to see a large number of its sailors mutiny against government authority. And a few days later, the socialist leaders in Berlin will establish a German republic, and pretty much at the request of President Wilson, the United States is not going to step in and help them unless the Kaiser Wilhelm leaves and abdicates his throne. And so he gives up his throne around November 9th. And as a result of that, they look at ending this thing at the 11th hour, on the 11th day, in the 11th month of 1918. Germany agreed at that point to cease fire and sign that armistice, or what's called a truce, to end the war. And that November 11th, for the longest time, was known as Armistice Day. And eventually, as a result of World War II and other wars, that became known as Veterans Day. How many people died during World War I? This is just astronomical. It was probably the bloodiest war in history up to that time. Death numbers were about 22 million, and more than half of them probably civilians. In addition to that, 20 million people were wounded, 10 million more just simply became refugees. The United States lost 48,000 men in battle, with another 62,000 dying of disease. More than 200,000 Americans wounded, and we were only there for a short time. So that ends section 2. Thank you for listening, and again, make sure you complete the assignment that goes along with this.